by Professor Schammel on Dante and his Divine Comedy. I thought I'd make a couple of comments about it. Both the Middle Ages and the Italian Renaissance claim Dante, and that would be an interesting question to ask on the final exam. Is Dante more medieval, or is he more Italian Renaissance? And we might ask the same question about Chaucer as well after we hear the lecture about Chaucer. I kind of lean toward the medieval, and there are very many medieval things that she touched on in this lecture. You're all shaking your head, yes. What was really medieval about Dante as she was described? Don't forget to press your mic. Yeah. What was medieval about?
The way he believed in hell and how it was dark and how it was before the light, and they considered themselves the light, and then before them everything was dark. So
I thought the symbolism, I think you're pointing to the symbolism, and the symbolism seemed very medieval to me, that this is quite a medieval trait. How about the mathematical qualities of it all, based on threes and exactly 100 cantos, the first one being the introduction, and then 99 broken down into 33, 33, 33. That struck me as being very medieval, the mathematical qualities that remind you of St. Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologica, which is very mathematical, and the mathematical qualities of the Gothic cathedral. And all of these I think are very medieval, that is something that medieval people do. And that's part of the reason, system, and order that we see in the medieval Renaissance, the use of it. Also, I thought I'd clarify a couple of terms that she used. She talked about incontinence, and what she meant there was excessive indulgence of the appetites, whether it's gluttony or sex or greed, or that's what she meant by incontinence, sort of addiction. You know, it's what we talk about in the world today as addiction, indulging the appetites. When she talked about anti-purgatory, she meant a sort of forecourt or a pre-purgatory, and where people entered into purgatory. And she also talked about it as being very architectural, and that struck me as quite medieval as well. And also the satire. Medieval people liked good jokes, and we saw some jokes with the popes upside down with their feet in the air and their toes being burned by the flames. And so Dante liked a good joke, and that was very medieval as well. But there were some Renaissance things about it. Certainly the Renaissance claims Dante. It reminds me of a very famous quotation from a student exam that said that Dante stood with one foot firmly in the Middle Ages and the other saluting the rising sun of the Renaissance. Think about that a minute. You have to think about it. Anyway, let's take a look at this map again. Could we look at this map? And could we look at the map? Yes, okay. So that we can see where Dante was. I sort of flipped by it fast before. Here is the map of Italy, and here is Florence, and then he spent his exile in Ravenna, which is right about up here. So that allows you to place Dante in time and space. Here is the purgatory. Here is one view of purgatory that's kind of interesting, with the monsters in it eating people up. And again, they're cartoon sort of joke monsters. This is very medieval. And here is a lovely miniature that illustrates the view of Dante's Paradise, representing the poet and Beatrice. We usually call her Beatrice, but Beatrice transported to the moon, the abode of women devoted to chastity. And so we can see the chaste women on the moon here in this representation. Dante died in 1321, and the Black Death struck in 1347 in Italy, and the next year it spread northward year after year. It returned year after year. Society, economy, and the entire world of the Middle Ages was turned upside down, and many people think that the Black Death represented the end of the Middle Ages, the end of the High Middle Ages, and I agree with that theory. 40% of the population died, more in the cities and less in the country. The good clerics died, and the incompetents, the unlearned, the ill-educated vied for their post. There was a crisis of belief because people thought, why is God punishing us? We must be sinful, and so people couldn't believe anymore. And the plague came through the trade routes, it came through Byzantium and over the Mediterranean, up Italy, and finally by 1349 it reached England and it broke out everywhere. There were food shortages and labor shortages. Peasant labor was in demand, and thus the statute of laborers, which we heard about in Palmer's lecture, was passed. And what it did was clamp wage controls on those peasants. They couldn't demand higher wages because labor was scarce, and so it forced them to accept a lower wage. All the trade routes were interrupted, both international and local. Survivors in the cities and in the countryside grabbed the spoils. Whole families died out and no one could hold their lands, and so people just grabbed it, opportunists grabbed it, and people got rich quick. Nobody knew what caused the plague. Of course, we know it was the fleas on a certain kind of black rats who spread a bacterial infection. But they didn't know what caused it, so the Jews were accused of poisoning the well. And people thought maybe their sins had caused it, and so they went around whipping themselves. These were the flagellants who traveled from one city to another, whipping themselves, hoping to atone for their sins that had caused the plagues. Peasants revolted because there was a revolution of rising expectations. Because their labor was in demand, the peasants wanted more. They rebelled against the lords, and they committed horrible crimes against the lords, torturing them and killing them. And the lords responded in kind. And so it was an age of violence that was spawned by the plague. There was a complete change in mentalité. Art changes, and so scenes of death and funerals abound. Frogs and snakes eating dead bodies, scenes of horror, death, and torture. Devils and witches now seem real and not comic anymore. Alternatively to this horrible art, there is idealistic fantasy art, so they sort of go from one extreme to the other. On the one hand, horrible scenes of death and torture and devils. On the other hand, happy peasants enjoying themselves in the fields, idyllic nobles at play. And this is the international Gothic art, a fairy tale world. And here we'll see some funerals. Here is a funeral that's typical of the age after the Black Death. Here is a kind of the reign of the Antichrist, scenes of horror and torture and horrible things happening. Here are devils torturing people, torturing them on the wheel. Here is, this is by Hieronymus Bosch, Brugal the Elder and Hieronymus Bosch both do these horror scenes of devils torturing people in hell. Here are devils that look, and beasts that look real. They're not cartoons, they're not jokes anymore. They're real to people. And here is a witch who now looks real instead of, witches are taken seriously, whereas they weren't before. The late Middle Ages, after the Black Death, is the great age of witchcraft, when people believe in witches once more. They didn't believe in them in the High Middle Ages. Here's the opposite, the sort of happy peasants in the field. And here are the happy peasants, you know, the idealism, the fairy tale world of the dancers, who are dancing, and here is another fairy tale kind of pictures of the maidens in their beautiful ideal garden. Here is another example of this idealized world, the idealized marriage, and compare that to the kind of pre-Black Death art that's more symbolic and plain and even realistic in a way. And this again is after the Black Death, the sort of idyllic fairy tale type of world. Cynicism abounds. A lot of faith is lost and mysticism replaces reason. Now reason is no longer invoked. St. Bonaventure and Martin Luther were both mystics. They were into mysticism, and they had apocalyptic visions, the Wheel of Fortune, the Danse Macabre, which we have in our readings book about how everybody's going to die, and how each person is leveled by death, appears. And Ring Around the Rosie, that's a song about the Black Death. The Rosie is the Black Death, and all fall down, that means everybody dies. Extremes of all kinds abound. The world is turned upside down, and this is the world of Chaucer. Here's St. Bonaventure. Here is the Wheel of Fortune turning the world upside down. The Physician from the Danse Macabre. And let's then go to what we're going to see right now, which is the lecture by Lorraine Stock, Chaucer and His World. Okay.
Speaking to you tonight about Geoffrey Chaucer. He's probably, for England at any rate, the most famous known author. There were other famous authors, but we don't know their names. They're anon. But we do know the name of Geoffrey Chaucer. And Chaucer he lived in the second half of the 14th century. He died in a nice, round, easy-to-remember year, 1400, which some people mark as actually the beginning of the end of the Middle Ages anyway. And so Chaucer, in some ways, is a kind of last gasp of real medievalism, and some think he is also a breath of the wind of the change that comes with the Renaissance. I happen to think that he is very typically medieval in many, many ways. I have a picture of him here on the desk if you'd like to show it. It's a portrait of him. We have a few portraits of him that have been done in near contemporary paintings, and believe it or not, he looked something like this engraving, which is, I think, an engraving of some of the near contemporary portraits that have been done. What I'd like to talk to you today about, Dr. Vaughan talked about the plague, and that's certainly true that Chaucer wrote post-plague, and in many, I guess, respects represents the post-plague spirit of England and Europe. The very fact that he is writing in the second and, well, actually the third quarter of the 14th century shows that he was a survivor of the plague, and also that the people that he writes about in the Canterbury Tales, as we'll see, also can be considered survivors of sorts of plague or otherwise. They're quite a interesting crew of people. His most famous work, he did write other things, but the thing I think that most people know him for is his great combined text combining many different literary genres of the Middle Ages, all wrapped up into one big package known as the Canterbury Tales, which is a frame story framed by a pilgrimage that a group of 29 people from various walks of life in various places in England all embark on in April to visit the shrine of St. Thomas a Becket in Canterbury, which was maybe one of the most famous shrines in England. It happens to be a shrine that is a local shrine, though. As we'll see when we talk about one of his pilgrims, the wife of Bath, who was quite a pilgrimage goer of sorts. She was almost a professional pilgrimage goer. She had been to many of the other sites in Europe and abroad, even in the Middle East. She had been to Jerusalem. And that's quite a ways to go. You could go to Rome, or you could go to Cologne, or you could go to Bologna, or you could go to any number of different places. And Chaucer chooses to have this group of pilgrims kind of do the local version of the pilgrimage. They're going to Canterbury. They're not going to Rome, and they're not going to Jerusalem. They're sort of taking a short vacation, or really not vacation. It's a religious journey, but by the end of the 14th century, these pilgrimages had lost some of their original religious fervor, and judging by this group of pilgrims that we have in this particular group, they were out quite a bit as much for fun and pleasure and getting themselves out of the house in April after a long winter as they were for visiting the shrine and doing penitence and all the other usual things that one did when one went on a pilgrimage. I'd like to talk about the opening of the general prologue because they are among the most famous opening lines of any literary piece anywhere, anytime, especially in English. They also influenced other writers who took off from these opening lines and sort of did their own thing with it, and you might recognize that after we talk about it. What I've given you here is my modernization, not exactly a translation, but a modernization of Chaucer's language, which would have been in Middle English when he wrote it. I urge you at some point in your life, if you ever get the chance, to try to read Chaucer in his original language. You get much more out of it. The music of the poetry comes through much clearer than it does in my sort of pedestrian translation or modernization. And you really get a sense of the poet Chaucer, not just the ideas that Chaucer happens to be representing in his poetry. Just to give you an idea of what Middle English would sound like before I go and talk about the content of what's going on in these particular lines and these particular portraits that I've chosen for you, I'm going to recite for you some of those opening lines, the most famous part of them in Middle English, so that you get an idea of the poetry. You might want to read along with your text in the modernization just so that you sort of know where I'm going. You'll recognize some of the words, though, I think. They are some of the most famous words, as I said, that you'll ever hear coming at the beginning of the poem. One that Aprillo with his surest sota, the drucht of March, hath pierced to the rota, and bathed every vein in switch liqueur, of which thereto engendered is the fluor. When Zephyrus eke with his sweete breath, in spirit hath in every holt and haith the tender croppice, and the younge sun hath in the ram his halve course erana, and smalle fuales maken melodia, that slapen all the nicht with open ear, so pricketh them natur in her courages. Than longen folk to go on pilgrimages, and palmers for to saken stronge strondis, to ferne hallowis, couth in sundry londes, and specially from every sheeres end of England to Canterbury they wende, the holy blissful martyr for to sake, that him have holpen when that they were sake. Now what those lines give off is the immediate aura of springtime and all that that betokens. By the way, you might recognize that T.S. Eliot, in his probably most famous poem, The Wasteland, begins, April is the cruelest month, and that is a direct reference to Chaucer's opening line about April here. One thing about this that you may or may not recognize, if you've read some medieval poetry, you may recognize it, and by now I think you've read a fair amount. This opening was a fairly standard one for love poetry. Love poems about coming home from the Crusades or being at the Crusades, or love poetry from a male to a female, often, or romances, often begin with this invocation of spring, either in April or May. Usually they begin with the usual tropes that you find here, the same tropes that we see over and over again. The birds, the trees, the flowers, the sunshine, the breezes blowing, the babbling brooks often. Lovely, lovely imagery. And what follows this almost trite invocation of nature standardly is, when all of these things are going on, then folk long to make love. Now, what Chaucer does is sort of pull the rug out from under our expectations, because he tells us, when April with his sweet showers has pierced to the root the drought of March, and then he goes through, almost as though this were a calendar page in a medieval calendar, tells us the time of year by the zodiological sign of the ram. This is April. He talks about the god of the wind, Zephyrus. He talks about the sun running its course through the sky. This is a very energetic sun. This is no sluggish sun. This sun really runs when he gets going. And he's halfway through the sign of the ram. That places a date that we can fix for when this pilgrimage started, somewhere about April 17th, April 18th, thereabouts. The birds are making melody. These birds who are being urged or pricked or prodded by nature to keep their eyes open at night when ordinarily they would be sleeping. And Chaucer means us to take a little wink at this and realize that these little birdies in the trees are doing more than just staying up. This is a reference to fertility, to the urges that these birds are feeling at this time of the year. Now, normally what we would expect, and notice that the first 18 or 19 lines consist of one sentence, and that one sentence consists of several when clauses followed by a then clause. When April does da-da-da-da-da-da, when Zephyrus does da-da-da-da-da-da, when the birds are singing, etc. Then, and what comes after the then is not then the birds and the people and everybody else longs to make love, but then folk long to go on pilgrimages. And this is not really what we should be expecting. This is certainly not what Chaucer's audience would have expected from such an opening. And, you know, this is almost a thud. What? Pilgrimages? Well, why pilgrimages? Why would springtime be a good time to go on pilgrimage? One very practical reason is that I mean, in Houston, it's a little hard to sort of get this because it's like springtime most of the year. But in England, especially during the minor ice age that they had been going through in the 14th century, we have a very cold climate. Winter is very severe. And when April finally does thaw things out just a bit, everyone has been suffering from cabin fever for months, and they are itching to sort of go out on the road and do something and go somewhere. And a pilgrimage to Canterbury from London is a short enough little jaunt. Nowadays, you can take the train and get there in an hour. It would have taken several days by horseback in the Middle Ages. But by April, the roads would have been good enough, and people would have been feeling the urge to get out and do something. And why not go to Canterbury? Well, April is the time of year when not only does springtime make the sap flow in not only trees but people, but also it's the time of Lent and then Easter and a time for spiritual renewal. This would be a good time to go and renew your soul as well as your body. And so we have this combination of all of these secular as well as religious impulses that are going into why these Canterbury pilgrims are going to Canterbury at this particular time in April, in this particular day. They happen to all meet together in a tavern in Southwark, which is southeast of London. It's a place across the Thames, a good jumping off place to start a pilgrimage if you were about to embark. And by the way, the pilgrimage route going from London to Canterbury in Kent is reversed, or the reversal of the route taken by the peasants in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when they marched from Kent, Canterbury is in Kent, toward London and wreaked havoc in London, burned down lots of things, and made their grievances known. I don't know whether Chaucer had this in mind when he chose this route going from London to Canterbury, but it is an odd coincidence that that happens to be the exact inverse of the Peasants' Revolt. Now we have these 29 pilgrims in an inn getting ready to go out. They've never met each other before. They are a motley assortment of people. They are quite from diverse walks of life and different classes and different kinds of groups and certainly different genders, although most of them are male. There are only a few females on the journey, and that would have been fairly typical. Women didn't get out as much. And the people who are on the trip who happen to be female are an odd inclusion as well. Several nuns and the very worldly wife of Bath, who we'll talk about. We'll talk about both of those women in a few minutes. Why would they want to go, a bunch of strangers go on a trip to Canterbury together? Well, for one thing, travel was dangerous in the Middle Ages. They'd want the company not only for companionability, but also for safety's sake. There were cutthroats, there were highwaymen, and in order to ensure a safe arrival in Canterbury, this group decides that they're going to go together. Harry Bailey, I don't have this part for you, Harry Bailey proposes, he is the innkeeper, and he proposes a storytelling contest to while away the time while they're on these several tedious days of horseback riding toward Canterbury. And that's what the rest of the Canterbury Tales are about, the telling of the tales by those pilgrims as they go on their way in the several days that it took. The pilgrim who is telling us all this is the narrator Chaucer, who fictionalizes himself into this group and plays the role of the reporter. He's now going to report to his audience what struck him about this group of 29 pilgrims, and he goes ahead and tells us everything that strikes him. Now, I want to just give you a little visual fix on where they're going. I have a couple of pictures here, engravings of Canterbury Cathedral. Canterbury Cathedral is one of the most beautiful Gothic cathedrals in England. It's still quite a tourist site, not only because of its ancient origins as a pilgrimage site, but also now because of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which is a famous evocation of that pilgrimage. Here are some other pictures of it, just so that you can get an idea of where these pilgrims are going. It is a wonderful cathedral. I urge you, if you get to England, to take that 1-hour train ride from London and get to Canterbury yourself for your own pilgrimage. Now, let's talk about these pilgrims. We have 29 of them. Chaucer tells us about all 29. I couldn't possibly, in the time that I'm given, talk about those 29 pilgrims, so I chose a couple of representative ones that I thought you would enjoy looking at and thinking about and wondering about, because Chaucer is at his best in some ways in these particular pilgrims' portraits. The first one that I'd like to look at, and he says he's going to tell us things about them that strike him, among which are the condition of them as it seemed to me. And that's a very important clause, as it seemed to me. This is what strikes him as a kind of eyewitness observer. He also says which they were and what degree, and the degree here refers to their class, and he's very interested in class. And post-plague England, as well as other places in Europe also, is really so driven by rising classes and falling classes. The social changes that took place as a result of the plague were enormous. And one of the advantages that the survivors of the plague had was that they could move their way up the social ladder if they took the opportunity, and many of them did. A couple of the people that we're going to be looking at tonight are those upwardly mobile risers and shiners and movers and shakers, as we'll see. This other one, the first one that we're going to begin with, is not necessarily one of those upwardly mobile types. She is a more traditional type. And we'll talk about her. I have, in fact, an engraving of a Benedictine nun. Now, that is not necessarily the type of nun that Chaucer's nun is. And I'll leave her here and hope that you can see her on camera. And I would suppose that you might have your own ideas of what a nun ought to look like, dress like, and deport and comport herself like, probably judging from your own experiences of nuns, although nowadays nuns wear more modern dress than they did even when I was a child. This particular nun, is there something about her that is surprising? Not this nun, not the picture nun, but Chaucer's nun, who happens to be a prioress, that is to say, the head of a convent. She is the sort of mother superior to a group of younger women who would be her charges in the convent. Therefore, a model for those younger nuns. And this particular nun, who Chaucer speaks about in very pleasant terms, describes at great length, in much more length probably than we would expect, given this picture of a nun that I have on the camera that shows a woman in a very plain costume, with rosary beads, with a prayer book in her hand, with a very subdued garment that she's wearing, a wimple and a cloak in dark colors. No flashy jewelry or furs or anything. And to our surprise, Chaucer presents for us a quite worldly nun in the portrait that he gives us. This nun, this prioress, whose smiling was simple and coy, swore her greatest oath by Saint Eloy. Saint Eloy is Saint Eligius, who happened to be a saint who went to martyrdom rather than swear himself, and also who was the patron saint of jewelers. Now, it strikes me that that is a very odd saint for this particular holy woman to be swearing by, mainly because she swears by a saint who himself refused on pain of death to swear, and also because he happens to be the patron saint of jewelers. This is a nun. Well, of course, she's a nun who happens to have rather gaudy taste, as we'll see, in jewelry, and so maybe that's her reason for swearing by Saint Eligius. The name of the nun might also have surprised you, Madame Eglantine. Eglantine means the briar rose. Have any of you ever known nuns and what names these nuns have taken when they took their vows? What kinds of names do they usually have? Saints' names, Sister Aloysius Joseph or something like that, right? This nun is called by a flower name, and one of the most erotic flowers, the rose. In the 13th century, this enormously popular, very erotic romance, the Roman de la Rose, was written in French, a story about the idealization of a courtly lady as a rose. And here is a woman who is a nun in a convent who is named after that flower. What else? He tells us a lot about her physical appearance. And this is a surprise because for a nun who ought to look as plain as this, you would think there would be nothing to tell much about her physical appearance. Instead of which, he tells us lots of things about her. He tells us about her French. She can speak French, even though she's an Englishwoman. Well, that's not too surprising. After 1066, French was one of the standard languages, if not the language in England. She speaks French, though, not with a Parisian accent, but very proudly with a British accent. And you know how the French feel about the way their language is usually enunciated by English-speaking people. I think she shouldn't be all that proud of her English-French accent, but she is. He then tells us at great length about her table manners. Why? He gives us something like 10 or 12 lines on how she comports herself at table. One thing that you may or may not know is that people in the clergy were supposed to eat very temperately. In fact, they were supposed to eat only sort of a subsistence diet. This woman obviously eats very, very well. She also eats elegantly. She is not a slob at the table. She doesn't wet her fingers in the sauce. No drop falls on her breast. It's sort of odd, though, that the narrator should even be thinking about a nun's breast and what falls on it when he gives us this long description of her table manners. She reaches for meat. That's another thing that only the nobility ate meat. I was joking before and said beans is what you ought to bring to the party. Very few people could afford a daily diet with meat or even fowl in it, and this woman obviously eats very, very well. She drinks. She drinks wine. She's very amiable at the table. She pains herself to counterfeit the cheer of court. There's something about the word counterfeit that rings a little hollowly here about this woman. She puts on the manners of the court. She'd rather be like a courtly lady than be like a nun. She wants to be stately of manner. She wants to be worthy of reverence. Well, finally, he gets around to what we would have expected all along. And when Chaucer says but, it's like dropping the shoe. Chaucer always has some interesting things to follow the but, the magic but. But to speak of her conscience, well, conscience, now conscience is the realm of the intellect, the soul, moral choice, what we would expect about a nun and what a nun would be about. To speak of her conscience, she was, now, does the following represent items that should be of interest to the conscience, in your opinion? She was so charitable, so piteous, she would weep if she saw a mouse caught in a trap, or if she saw it dead or bled. She had small dogs that she fed with roasted meat or milk or wastel bread. which happens to be the second finest quality of bread, next to the kind of bread that was used for Holy Communion wafers. This is the food that she feeds to her dogs. This woman's dogs eat better than most people in the Middle Ages did. They eat meat, they eat milk, they eat the second finest grade of bread possible. And she gets really upset. She weeps if one of her dogs dies or if somebody beats it with a stick. And all was conscience and tender heart. Now this section on her conscience, what exactly does Chaucer mean by this woman's conscience? She's self-absorbed. She's so self-absorbed. This is not conscience, this is sentiment. She's sentimental. She cries like a baby if her little dogs get hurt. Should she have dogs? Should nuns have pets? No. But courtly ladies like Isolde, in Tristan and Isolde, often had little pet lapdogs that they carried around with them in romances. This lady, I think, rather fancies herself more like a lady in a romance than she does a nun. Her conscience leaves little to speak of, actually. And then he gets to her physical appearance, having dismissed the conscience part as being really, not much to talk about. She wears a dainty pleated wimple. Well, that was a typical headdress worn by women in the Middle Ages. That's not too surprising. Her nose is elegantly shaped. Her eyes as gray as glass. Her mouth very small and soft and red. She has a fair, wide, broad forehead. It was the fashion in the Middle Ages for ladies to have high foreheads. They even sometimes shaved their hairlines to push it back and make their foreheads even higher up. She has a forehead that's almost 8 inches wide. I mean, this woman has a head like a colossus. Well, and then the rest of her, he says, he's sort of been doing from this top of the body down. He gets down to the neck, and then he says the rest of her was hardly undergrown. In other words, all that eating of good food has finally added up to something here. This is no skinny nun we have. She's quite hefty. Now, what about this physical description of her? What strikes you about it? Is this appropriate? He tells us at the beginning, I'm going to tell you what struck me about these people. What strikes you about what strikes him about this nun? Her lips. What about her lips? They're soft and red. How does he know that? Why does he notice that her lips are soft and red? This is a nun. This is one of these very somber-looking, supposedly, women. But this woman gives off signs to Chaucer that make him think in sensual terms. I'm not saying that he's flirting with her or she's flirting with him, but there is something about this woman that makes Chaucer think about her in more secular terms than he ought to, or than we would expect him to. What about the crowning touch? Her cloak is elegant. Well, I'd hardly call this picture elegant. Plain, yes. Functional, yes. Elegant, I don't know. She wears small rosary beads like the ones in the picture, but oh, with a little bit of a difference. These rosary beads are made of coral. They're quite bright. I mean, what is the color of coral is almost the color of the carpet here. It's a quite bright orange red. Her rosaries are made of coral, gauded, that is to say, gilded, or these gauded beads are sort of covered over with a kind of green tinge over them to make them even more gaudy. And on these beads hangs not a crucifix like the one on the picture of the nun that I've shown you, but what? A medallion, a brooch, shining, golden, on which is a crowned A and the words in Latin, Amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. Now, some of Chaucer's critics who want to be kind to the prioress have said that the amor in Amor vincit omnia refers to love of God. But if you consider the rest of her costume, her manners, her mannerisms, the cheer that she counterfeits at court, I hardly think that amor refers to only God, if at all. Certainly, we have other kinds of erotic love, going along with the April impulse to pilgrimage. And what is this woman doing on the pilgrimage anyway? Why isn't she back at the convent taking care of the nuns under her charge? Nuns were not supposed to travel. Certainly she shouldn't be out and about the way she is. A very ironic portrait, I think, considering what we expect from a nun and what we get here. Now, some of the other characters that Chaucer has shown us, and by the way, here's a map of England to give you an idea that we are now beyond Dante. And by the way, Chaucer did know Dante's work and had read Dante's Divine Comedy and refers to Dante. So Dante comes before Chaucer and is used by Chaucer, referred to by Chaucer quite often in his works. We're in England. We're going from London to eastward to Canterbury, which is in Kent, going this way. And the Pilgrims are include among them another type called a Franklin, his name simply means a free man, that is, a landowner. And this Franklin, given all the things that we've now talked about, the food and the love of food of the prioress, sort of takes that theme another step. The Franklin, who is a secular person, who is not under the same sort of restrictions that the prioress is under, is, as Chaucer puts it, an Epicurean. What do we know about Epicurus, the philosopher Epicurus? This is sort of a simplification of his philosophy, but it's the one we know about him. What was the motto that sort of went along with Epicureanism? Well, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. You know, this notion that you seize life and sort of grab it by the food and eat everything you can. This particular Franklin, he loves food. He loves in the morning a sop in wine. This is the leftover bread from the night before, which has soaked up all the wine and juices and gravies from the night before meal, and he eats that for breakfast in the morning. To live in delight was his habit. He was Epicurus's own son. He's a householder and a great host. Anybody would love to be invited to his house. He gives quite a party. The bread, the ale in his house was uniformly good. He was no better envined, that is to say, a man with wine in his house. There's no better man for giving out wine than this guy is. And one of my favorite lines in all of Chaucer, a wonderful image of flesh and fish so plentiful, it seemed to snow meat and drink in his house. Just think about that for a second. The image of food sort of snowing down from the sky. It seemed to snow meat and drink at this man's house, of all possible delicacies that men could devise. He changed his menu and his supper by the seasons of the year. He didn't have to eat dried fish all year round. He ate seasonally. He ate whatever was in season, and that was fairly a luxury at the time. He has partridges, fish in his ponds. Woe was the chef unless the sauces were pungent, spicy. Spices are very expensive. One of the reasons for the explorers going to the New World was to try to find trade routes that would allow them to get spices more easily from Asia. He uses spices which are expensive. This shows that he is a man who is well-to-do. This man is in the rising, upwardly mobile, nouveau riche bourgeoisie. He is trying to sort of make his way up into the aristocracy by living the life of a nobleman. He covers his table standing dormant in the hall. This may seem like no big thing to you, but in the Middle Ages, they didn't have dining rooms. They had trestles, and then they would put a board over the trestle when they were about to dine, and then when the dinner was over, they simply dismantled the table, put the trestles away, and hung up the board, and no longer had the table. But this man is an exception to that rule. He has his table dormant. In other words, the table is always set in case somebody comes to the door to be invited in for some of that good wine and partridge and all that other good stuff. He is lord and sire at sessions. He has a dagger, a purse of silk. He's been a sheriff. He's really sort of worked his way up. He's had all of the sort of civil jobs and appointments and even elected jobs that he could possibly get to sort of make him rise in the sort of petty aristocracy There was nowhere such a worthy vavasor. Vavasor is the feudal landholder. He is a man who is in control of his life. The tale that the Franklin will tell is a tale that you would expect more from a knight. And that goes in keeping with his upward mobility, I think. The next person I'd like to talk about, one of the favorite all-time characters in Chaucer, is his famous Alison of Bath, the wife of Bath. Now, the word wife in Middle English is a sort of ambiguous one, because though we think of wife in its modern connotation as being a married woman specifically, in Middle English it could mean a married woman or just a generic woman. A wife was any woman, and especially a married woman, of course, but any woman could be a wife. She's sort of all-purpose wife, or all-purpose, if you want to call her every woman from Chaucer's point of view. This woman sort of represents womanhood for him. A good wife from just outside of Bath. Bath is a city in England. It is a spa city, a kind of resort town. It's over to the west of London. And she comes from just outside of Bath. She is one of these entrepreneurial, middle-class, rising up in the ranks, who took advantage of changes after the plague and has her own business. We also find out a little later on that she has married 5 different men and been widowed 4 times. And we don't know about husband number 5. She also says at one point in her prologue, welcome the 6th husband whenever he comes down the road. So this is a very marrying woman. She is a woman, a sort of all-purpose woman, and an all-purpose married woman as well. Nobody's been married as often as the wife of Bath. Now, this may make you think of Elizabeth Taylor or Zsa Zsa Gabor, which are sort of anomalies in our society. But actually, in the Middle Ages, it was not that uncommon for people to marry several times because of the high mortality rate. And often a widow, if she married, especially as the wife did, married older men when she was young. And the first time she married was at 12, which is a shockingly young age to us, but not all that much out of line for the Middle Ages. Her first husband, she married at 12, and then she tells us that those were all old men. First 2 or 3 husbands were old. They died quickly. She inherited their property and became richer and richer as she married and married on and on. Her last husband, her 5th husband, was an Oxford clerk who was 20-ish, or 20-something, to her 40-something, which is a fairly large age disparity. But again, not that unusual in the Middle Ages for older women to be married to younger men who married these older women, both for their experience, as the wife of Bath tells us she is very good at that, but also for their money. This is a woman who has great wealth. She is a cloth maker. And cloth making was a big industry in England post-plague. They stopped just exporting raw wool and began to actually manufacture woolen cloths, very fine woolen cloths. We still think of England as being a great milling and weaving country, and we buy woolen sweaters and that sort of thing from the British Isles even today. She has her clothing, which we would expect him to describe. She is, after all, a secular woman, a wife even, a married woman, 5 times married woman. He describes her clothes, and they are, to say the least, outlandish. Red stockings, very bright red stockings, fine scarlet. She has moist shoes. Chaucer has a real affinity for shoes because, to some extent, if someone could wear really good shoes, it proved that they had a lot of money. The expression "to be well-heeled" comes from this notion that if you can afford very, very high-quality shoes, you've really got a lot of disposable cash to spend. And he tells us that her shoes were very moist, that is, very newly tanned leather. This interest in shoes may come, because he's always talking about the Pilgrims' shoes, may come from the fact that sometime way back when, Chaucer's own family were probably shoemakers, because the word Chaucer is the French for chausse, C-H-A-U-S-S-E, the word for shoe. So Chaucer means shoemaker. And although his immediate father and grandfather were wine importers, and he too, Chaucer, was a member of this rising, upwardly mobile middle class trying to rise its way up in the ranks, Chaucer has shoemakers somewhere back in his lineage, and so maybe that's why he's so interested. I don't know. She's a worthy woman. She's had 5 husbands at the church door, not including other company in her youth. Well, if youth is somewhere below 12, I don't know when this girl started, but pretty early, I guess. So we have 5 husbands plus assorted other lovers that he won't even mention. There's no reason to go into that now, he says. She also, as we said before, is a almost professional pilgrimage maker. I have a map of Europe here which shows you some of the places. Now here we are, England. She's coming from London. She's been to Cologne, which is in Germany. She's been to Italy, Bologna. She's been to Jerusalem, which is down here somewhere in the Holy Land. She's really gotten around. And not only has she been to these other places, Spain too. She's been to Spain at the shrine of Compostela, St. James of Compostela, very, very famous pilgrimage goal in the Middle Ages. She also knows a lot about wandering by the wayside, which tells us something a little more than pilgrimages that she makes. She sort of goes down the primrose path a few times. Her tooth, her gap in her tooth in medieval physiognomy was a sign of lustiness and lecherous inclinations, which certainly her 5 marriages and other wandering by the wayside might indicate as well. Her clothing is sort of odd too. Her wimple on her hat, on her head, is as broad as a buckler or a shield. That's an odd comparison to make about a woman's hat, that it's like a soldier's shield. Also, she has large hips with an overskirt over them, sharp spurs on her shoes, which is another odd little detail. Now, in her own prologue to her tale, she will tell us that her personality is a result of her horoscope, that at the moment of her birth was a collision of the planets of Mars and Venus. Just think about it. We now have a book called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. The wife of Bath is a collision of Mars and Venus. And the spurs and the buckler or shield may be indications of her martial side, her Mars, very feisty, kind of tough side. The Venus side of her certainly comes out in her love of love. And we find out in the last couple of lines that she could joke in fellowship, she knew the remedies for love sickness, and she knows the old dance. And by old dance, Chaucer is euphemizing, not just Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers or John Travolta and Saturday Night Fever or Dirty Dancing. Well, yeah, maybe Dirty Dancing. This is the old dance. She knows a lot about dancing that old dance. Now, the miller is another character who really comes down a few notches on the social ladder. Certainly not even in the upwardly mobile group. This is a miller who happens to be a kind of tradesman sort. He is really a representative for Chaucer of the common folk. And common he is. Stout, physically, he's all body. I mean, there's nothing that Chaucer says about this man's intellect or his conscience or well, in fact, he tells us later on that he cheats, which is not too surprising. But almost the entire portrait is taken up with physical details. And the man is a lout. He is a huge, hulking, sort of pig-like thug. He has big, brawny bones. His favorite sport is wrestling. Now, no elegant man would ever stoop to something like this. Their sports were hunting and jousting and the like. Wrestling is really sort of beneath contempt, yet that's what this guy does. He's short-necked, broad, a thick lug. There's no door he can't heave off of its hinges or break running at it with his head. For fun, this guy knocks doors off their hinges with his head. So that tells us a little bit about the quality of the brains underneath the skull. They've been sort of tossed around a little bit, I think. The red beard, as red as any fox or sow, gives us an idea that this man is very animal-like, and he is. The tip of his nose, one of those telling little details that Chaucer loves to give, a wart. Big, ugly, horrible wart. And not just a wart, but this wart has a tuft of hairs. I mean, Chaucer's taking us with almost a kind of a zoom lens and zooming us into this man's nose so that we get a close-up of not just the nose, but the wart with these bristly sort of hairs coming out like the bristles of a sow's ear. His nostrils are black and wide, like a cauldron. I mean, this man, and his mouth is like a cauldron. If you think about it, the description of this man's face is all orifices, big nostrils, big gaping mouth. Little up here, but what can I say? And out of that mouth comes filth, the narrator says. Dirty jokes. And if any of you have ever read, it's one of the most highly anthologized of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. The Miller's Tale is the one about the fart. Once you've read it, you can sort of never forget it. And this is the one that comes out of the old dirty mouth of the miller, just about what we would expect from him from what Chaucer tells us here. He talks about sin and harlotry. He also talks about his conscience. This guy really needs to make this pilgrimage, although I doubt if this is the reason that he's on the trip. He can steal expertly. He charges 3 times the real price of the goods. What a miller did, in fact, was people would bring their wheat or their grain or their rye to the mill and have it ground into flour, which they would then cook into bread. So that's what he does. And he, ironically, is the leader of the pilgrimage procession out of the inn to Canterbury, and he plays this big phallic bagpipe to toot them sort of out of the inn on their way to Canterbury. Well, are there any questions about anything that I've talked about so far, or anything about Chaucer or the post-plague period in England that strikes you?
Doesn't a lot of current English parallel, the stories parallel a lot of the English or American stories that we have today?
Which ones? Could you be a little more specific?
I guess some of the plots are similar to like Young Goodman Brown and whatnot, and you know.
Well,
Charles
if you
Fox
mean by
Warner.
allegory, I think that's what you're talking about. This would have been common not only to Chaucer but to other medieval writers. There were a lot of writers of allegory in the Middle Ages, and I don't know that I don't think writers write allegory a whole lot anymore, but they certainly did at the time. Well, I guess Hawthorne was influenced by medieval writers, and romance especially. So yes, Hawthorne would have been influenced possibly by Chaucer, but more likely by a writer like Sir Thomas Malory, who wrote romances about the knights of King Arthur's Round Table.
Well, like Young Goodman Brown, you know, they give the description of seeing his young wife Faith, and then the pink ribbon sailing through the air.
Yeah.
And
oh, I see. You mean in the
devil's a
portraits? You mean in the portraits?
Well, I was just making a comment that
Okay.
it seems that there's a lot of similarities.
Okay. Yeah, I think you're right. Are there any other questions or comments that you'd like to make? Yes.
It seems that the whole gist of the stories is very broad in common society. Was it written with the intention of being showcased for the rich, or was it something that the poor could also make fun of some of the rich, and the rich could make fun of some of the poor, and vice versa?
Yes, I think if you read the Canterbury Tales themselves, the tales that these various pilgrims, that he gives you a little sketch of each one of the pilgrims. We've only done 4 of them. There are 29. The tales that the tellers tell often are told about one another. For example, the miller tells a story about a reeve, and the reeve tells a story about a miller, and the summoner tells a story about a pardoner, et cetera, or a friar and a summoner tell stories about one another. The franklin tells a story about a knight. You get the idea. In a way, you get a kind of class rivalry going on through the stories that these pilgrims choose to tell about one another. And sometimes the stories are sort of thinly disguised, pointing, hey, I'm not talking about any miller, I'm talking about this miller, you know. And yeah, so I think you have all classes making fun of all classes in the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer is being very democratic in some ways. Anything else?
Yes, how are these tales received by the public?
How are they received by their immediate audience? Well, that's hard to say. Most likely these stories would have first been recited orally at court, and that would have been a noble or at least a mixed middle class and upper class audience. But there were many manuscripts of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales copied, and he became one of the most beloved authors in the period immediately after himself. He is printed, Caxton prints some editions, early printed editions of the Canterbury Tales. So he was quite popular, and always has been quite popular. Did I answer your question?
Yes,
Okay. Anything else? Yes.
What kind of statement do you think he's trying to make about religion? Certainly there are some characters such as the knight who are good and godly men, but then there's the prioress and there's the sumner, and there are a few others who are very corrupt in some way.
Almost none of his clergy people come off looking particularly well. There's only one exception, and that's the parson, who comes out looking like just the most perfect man you can imagine. And the rest of them all have flaws and peccadillos, some of them worse than others. I think the satire that he turns on the prioress is rather mild compared to what he does to the pardoner, for example. But he's an example of a kind of trend that culminates at the end of the Middle Ages in the Reformation. So that it's not really Chaucer saying anything out of line. All of this is sort of fermenting. At the same time that Chaucer is writing, there's a man named John Wycliffe who is preaching all of the sorts of tenets that later are associated with the Reformation, only he's doing it 100 years earlier. By the way, John Wycliffe was declared a heretic, and when he died, his bones were exhumed and burned, and the ashes thrown into the river. That's how much his ideas went over well in his own period. But in fact, later on in the Reformation, everything that he said sort of came to pass. So this is the beginning of the wind that eventually blows full force as the Reformation. Yes, he is being satirical about the clergy. Anything else? Yes, okay. We are now out of time. So, no, we're not.
We might spend just a couple of minutes here at the end doing two things, and perhaps all of us talking about the changes between Dante and Chaucer. And okay, and I left the class with the question, what is the difference between Dante and Chaucer? Do any of you want to make a comment that could start our discussion here? Use your microphones, please.
Well, it seems Dante is about ascension, kind of, and Chaucer isn't about ascension at all, really.
Okay, Chaucer's about ascension. Do you agree with that? No, Dante is about ascension, and Chaucer is something else. Can anybody put words to those?
Chaucer is more secular in his story. I am.
Okay.
Chaucer is more secular in his approach to the stories, or even though he has clergymen and women, involved in the stories, there's less, it seems, about the church and achieving divinity, or going to paradise or heaven.
However, at the end of the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer has his famous retraction in which he says, of course he has it both ways this way, after you've read through the entire corpus of the Canterbury Tales, he comes to the Parson's Tale, which is a long sermon on the 7 deadly sins. And then following that, he has his own retraction in which he says, I only want you to read the stories that are conducive to the health of your soul. Forget about the others. But of course, you've already read The Miller's Tale, and you've already read the other ones that are not conducive to the health of your soul. And so, he is groping toward the same impulse to be religious, but not quite in the same way.
Is he actually doing that, or is it more just a case of trying to cover himself?
Well, he may be covering himself, or it may be the end of his life, and he's starting. A lot of people, when they get close to death, think, what have I done? And maybe I shouldn't have done that. And so he may be two-faced about that, but he does put the retraction in and say, never mind.
Isn't
I didn't do that.
I kind of think of Dante as being very idealistic, and I was mentioning that to Luisetta at the break. Dante was idealistic, whereas Chaucer was kind of cynical and critical.
Well, he knew the ways of the world, yes. I mean, I wouldn't say that Chaucer didn't have ideals, but Chaucer was a realist, and he pretty much saw people the way they were and described them the way they were and did not generally idealize people. He tried to literally show them with their warts. If they had a wart, he told you that they had a wart, and he made it a big, ugly one with hairs coming out of it.
Well, how would you contrast Dante to that?
I would say that Dante certainly is a realist too.
Yes.
Has a very strong realism.
Yes.
And is very concrete in his imagination. And he condemns the corruption of the clergy more strongly than with great violence, and condemns the popes, the corrupted officials of the church. But is trying to keep together a world that is disappearing. And I have the feeling that Dante knew that he was the last bard, really, of this beautiful, splendid construction of the Middle Ages, that he was feeling that he was collapsing somehow. Because in Italy, too, there are a lot of changes.
Yes.
And I was added just a little detail about the Chaucer retracting everything at the end. That's Dante would never do that. He had the monarchia burn because the Pope gave the interdict.
Yeah.
But, for instance, Boccaccio, the author of the Decameron,
Yes.
who is closer to Chaucer, and he described the Black Death of 48,
Yes.
1348. At a certain moment in his life, he decided, because of a religious crisis, to burn the Decameron. And it was only the intervention of Petrarch who stopped him from this crime.
But you know, I have read some things about the Decameron and looked at it, and a number of the stories in it are actually medieval. I mean, like some of the Lays of Marie de France and some of the other short stories that are medieval appear in the Decameron. So the Middle Ages, I mean, it's too black and white to say Dante was serious and religious and idealistic and sort of positive, and Chaucer was more cynical.
Well, I consider Boccaccio a medieval author. Chaucer robbed from Boccaccio. I mean, he took some of Boccaccio's plots and simply rewrote them in Middle English.
But they go back to the 12th century.
He translated. Yes, he translated.
Right.
Yes. Inspired. Yes.
But they go back to the 12th century. They're there in the Lays of Marie de France, and the stories told. There's this little book that came out at the AHA, golly, when I was a graduate student, but it was called Bawdy Tales at the Courts of the Kings of France. And a number of those are actually in the Decameron, but they were written in 12th century France.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, they're quite bawdy, too.
Well, they compile these things because they've heard them and they're retelling them.
Type of encyclopedic type of organization of writing that
Well, and it's the medieval impulse to translate. I mean,
Yes.
Chaucer is. I once was teaching Chaucer, and one of my students was so disappointed when she found out that, as far as we knew, Chaucer didn't ever write a really original plot. That he had been borrowing plots from all these other writers. She said, "Oh well, he plagiarized." I said, "No, they didn't have that idea of plagiarism. It was an honor to take someone else's story and retell it, and that's really what he's doing. He's translating it for an English audience who can't read Italian. They can't read Dante. They can't read Boccaccio. They can't read some of the French texts that he was able to write, and then he read it. Yes.
The spirit,
Yeah.
the structure, the construction is giving to his work, not to the content, because we have been talking from the beginning of love and death, death and love, and back and forth. We have not added very much to that.
Well, but I still think Dante was kind of more serious, but I agree with you that he recognized that this high medieval culture we talked about as the flowering of the Middle Ages, this high point of it was changing into something else when Dante, well, in the first place he wrote in Italian instead of Latin, and so.
Talking to all the faithful, and it's reaching us, the readers.
Well,
today.
and that's true of Chaucer, too. He wrote in the vernacular. And some of his contemporaries, like John Gower, wrote in French and Latin and Middle English, but Chaucer chose, and he certainly knew he knew other languages. He knew Latin, and he knew French, and he knew Italian, but he chose to write in Middle English because he was writing to his native audience in that way. Yeah.
But again, this is not new, because going back to the 12th century and the romances of Chrétien de Troyes and the Lays of Marie de France, those were written in French also.
Yes.
So, and that was a couple of hundred years
Yep.
at least earlier.
Right.
So, what is new? What is new in this period as we move into the 14th century? What would you say is new and different from what we've looked at before? Do you have a question?
I think there's more characterization of there's more descriptions of the character. The individual has become more important.
I would tend not to agree, because the characterization of Dante's people, the soul in Inferno, they show such a strong individualism. They tell a story that defines them forever. Just one gesture, one moment of their life. They are frozen in that moment, but in such a powerful, powerful way that really Dante's characterization is superb.
I agree. I meant from the earlier medieval literature, the characters are defined better in both Dante and Chaucer.
It also seems, at least in Dante, that there's more of a social commentary going on. You have Dante, as you said, satirizing Boniface and the other characters that that have gone before him, bad princes or bad people or leaders of the opposing parties. I'm not sure if that happens also in Chaucer.
No, Chaucer is quite the politic man. In fact, Chaucer wrote at the time of Richard II in England, and he was a not very popular king and eventually was deposed and even put to death. And a lot of the people, and certainly Chaucer would have been one of the immediate circle of Richard. He was given all kinds of civil service jobs by the crown, and given pensions and that sort of thing by the crown. So he certainly owed his livelihood to the crown and was very associated with Richard. And yet, lots of other of Richard's immediate associates, when Richard fell, they fell too, and some of them were even put to death, put in the Tower of London, beheaded, etc. Chaucer survived. I mean, he knew how to survive. He was quite good at, telling you something without insulting you. And so I think that is a difference between them. Dante would, unflinchingly tell, this person is terrible and tell you why. And Chaucer never tells you anybody is terrible. I mean, he doesn't tell you the prioress is terrible. So she's so cute. She's so pleasant. She has such nice red lips. Leaves you to deduce that maybe this woman shouldn't be giving off these signals. But he never says anything bad about anybody. I mean, he just lets you infer these things.
Well, don't you consider that satire? You don't?
Well, it's smart.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
politics.
Actually directed.
Yes. Oh, yes.
It's irony, perhaps,
Yes.
more than
Yes.
satire.
Yeah.
And that is the difference.
Is this the first cases of this kind of satirization, going with Dante and Chaucer?
I don't think so, because going back to the 12th
No.
century
Yes.
literature, the Lays of Marie
Right.
de France, I
Yeah.
think are satire
Yeah.
myself, and others
Yeah.
have argued that. Can we take one more quick question? We're being signaled we have to
I
end.
was going to say, isn't there a certain aspect between the difference between the two, that there's a redemptive value, a redemptive direction in Dante's work, as far as his humor may be dark, but maybe it was a reflection of his mind and the whole idea of Florence and the outcast. I mean, he certainly wrote some before, but then after it happened, it really kind of, I don't want to use the word jaded, but it colored his writing. By the same token, with the Black Death, you have almost an escapism in that there's humor there, but it's very escapist, and it's fun to pick at all these different societies. So one's very kind of dark humor, and the other one's not necessarily dark humor, but satirical in a sense, and you've got to take everything with a grain of salt because you've had this great tragedy.
Yes. I would say that Dante is a judge, is judging us, and is judging all his characters. Is not kind to them. Sometimes he can have a great admiration for one of his characters. For instance, for Ulysses. Through the voice of Ulysses is giving us the most beautiful of his thoughts. You were not made to live like brutes, like animals, but to follow virtue and knowledge. It's a great ideal for humanity. Still, he condemns them to hell if he thinks that that is the right way.
It strikes me that Chaucer is more like ridicule than the kind of straightforward condemnation that Dante does.
I'm not even sure I'd say ridicule. I mean, I think ridicule is too strong because he doesn't actually himself make fun of anybody. He allows you, the audience, to infer what, I mean, and for some people they might not make any of these inferences. You know,
well, I suppose
those
that's
who
true.
have ears hear, those who don't, you know, that sort of thing.
Yeah, but we
And-
sort of giggle at it
yeah,
immediately,
yeah,
especially
yeah.
with that kind of